Welcome to the Roman red light district *. So, picture this. You're strolling down a crowded street in ancient Rome. The sun's blazing. The air smells like a mix of grilled meat, sewage, and sweaty tunics. And there's a guy yelling about olives like it's a life or death situation. You round the corner, and suddenly you're in a whole new vibe. Welcome to the Subura, Rome's red light district. Loud, dirty, sketchy, and busy. This is where the Pr0stitutes worked, lived, and hustled. And trust me, it wasn't exactly glamorous. Now, you might be thinking, wait, wasn't Rome all about togas and philosophers and emperors eating grapes? Well, yes, and also no. Rome was a city full of contradictions. It was deeply moral and deeply messy. There were temples to gods of love and fertility right next to streets full of brothels. Senators who gave long speeches about virtue during the day might sneak off to a brothel at night. Because Romans were nothing if not committed to multitasking. S3X work was just work in ancient Rome. Pr0stitution wasn't illegal. In fact, it was kind of just another job, not a respectable one, mind you, but definitely a legal one. Pr0stitutes were known as meretresses, that's the fancy Latin word, and they could be found all over the place: brothels, bathhouses, taverns, even working out of their own tiny apartments. Some were enslaved and forced into it. Others were free women or men who chose it out of economic desperation. A few even managed to turn it into a profitable business, working with higher-end clients. But no matter what corner of the trade they occupied, life was rarely easy, and don't go imagining velvet couches and sultry music. Roman brothels were, let's say, functional, tiny, windowless rooms. Straw beds, maybe a cheap oil lamp if you were lucky. The mood lighting wasn't doing any favors. The brothels of Romans had a whole system for this, the lupanar literally. Wolfden was the standard brothel. Pr0stitutes were sometimes called she-wolves, and yeah, the nickname stuck. The most famous lupanar is still around today. Actually, in Pompeii, before Mount Vesuvius did its thing, archaeologists uncovered a brothel with stone beds, yes, stone, dirty graffiti, and some very graphic paintings above each door to advertise services, sort of like an ancient menu, except with more nudity and less subtlety. Some brothels even had waiting areas, price lists, and guards. It wasn't fancy, but it was organized, a job, not a romance. Here's a fun fact: Romans had a very specific word for love, amor, but they had way more words for S3X, and they didn't mix the two very often. Pr0stitutes weren't supposed to inspire poetry. That was for noble women or idealized lovers. This was all business. If a client caught feelings, that was seen as kind of embarrassing. Imagine a senator writing a love poem to his favorite streetwalker. It happened, but everyone rolled their eyes about it, even in literature. When Pr0stitutes showed up, they were usually the comic relief or background characters, rarely the heroines. Still, they were part of the social fabric. Everyone knew they were there. Everyone pretended not to talk about it too much, and everyone definitely knew where to find them. Labels and stigma. Even though it was legal, Roman Pr0stitutes weren't exactly treated with respect. They couldn't get married to citizens, they couldn't testify in court, and they wore a specific kind of dress to set them apart. Some wore togas, weirdly, a sign of shame for women, or brightly colored tunics, or even wigs to mark them as working women. The stigma was real. A Pr0stitute might be tolerated, but she wasn't embraced. She could be mocked, taxed, even assaulted, and few people would stick up for her. And yet, despite that, the profession continued openly, publicly, and in massive numbers. Everyone knew where to look. So where exactly did all this go down? Glad you asked. Aside from the official lupanars, you could find Pr0stitutes outside taverns, chatting up drunk customers at the baths, offering extra services in alleyways, under flickering torchlight on balconies, advertising to people on the street below, even in temples. In certain cases, especially those dedicated to fertility gods like Venus, they'd hang a small lantern outside the door to show they were open for business. No neon signs, but the effect was the same. Who were the clients? Everyone. Seriously, everyone. Poor farmers, traveling merchants, Roman soldiers, local politicians, even poets. S3X work was so normalized that Pr0stitution was something many Roman men were expected to engage in. It wasn't seen as cheating, either. A married man visiting a brothel wasn't scandalous, as long as he wasn't falling in love or acting unmanly about it. Roman masculinity was weirdly fragile like that. Taxed, tracked, and regulated as the empire got more organized. Even S3X work got wrapped up in red tape. At one point, Pr0stitutes were required to register with the authorities, pay taxes, and keep their licenses up to date. Imagine having to fill out government paperwork just to, ancient Rome basically had a version of HR for brothels. Brutal, of course. Not everyone registered. Many worked off the books or on the move. The system was flexible, if not exactly kind. Wrapping up the day. So, what did a typical day in the Roman red light district look like? Early wake up, apply makeup, and get dressed to stand out, scout for clients, or wait at the brothel, work long hours, hope to avoid drunk customers, violence, or policemen, be sleep in the same room where you worked, wake up and do it all again, and that's just scratching the surface. A day in the life of a Roman Pr0stitute*. Alright, let's step into the sandals of a Roman Pr0stitute for one day. Don't worry, no actual labor required, just your imagination. Let's say her name is Livia. She lives in a tiny rented room, above a tavern in the Suburra, Rome's noisy and chaotic red light district. Her mattress is straw. Her window doesn't close properly. There's shouting in the street all night. And it smells like bad wine, spilled fish sauce, and wet stone. In other words, Rome. Let's see what a typical day looks like for Livia, from dawn to, well, whenever the last customer leaves. Morning, rise and serve. Livia wakes up early, maybe before sunrise. Not because she wants to, but because someone downstairs is already smashing amphory and cursing at a donkey. Rome doesn't do quiet hours. First things first, water. She grabs a bucket and heads out to the nearest fountain. Roman apartments didn't have plumbing. So, if you wanted to wash your face or your feet, it meant hauling it yourself. She's careful not to make eye contact with the baker's assistant across the street. He called her Chevalf yesterday and made howling noises. Classy guy, back in her room, she rubs olive oil on her skin to look fresh, applies a bit of rouge probably made from crushed minerals or questionable powders, and throws on a bright tunic. She wants to be noticed, but not too much. Balance is everything. Mid-morning, the business of attraction be now. The city is humming. Shopkeepers are shouting. Vendors are everywhere. And Livia is on the hunt for clients. She might lean on the tavern doorframe, flashing a knowing look to passers-by, or walk up and down the street slowly. She doesn't shout offers. That's for the desperate ones. Livia's worked this area for years. She has regulars. Sometimes she stops at the public baths around mid-morning, not to bathe, necessarily, but to linger near the men's entrances. Baths were full of steam, gossip, and opportunity. A subtle wink or touch could lead to late morning appointment. Sometimes, she'd even follow a client back home if he had coin and wasn't too weird. Still, most mornings are spent waiting, leaning, watching, flirting. It's not always exciting, but it's safer than nightfall, noon, food and friends. If you have either, let's say she makes a bit of money by lunchtime. Not much, a few sesterces maybe, enough to buy bread, some olives, and watered wine. She sits on the edge of a fountain with another girl she knows, Flavia, who works out of a brothel nearby. They eat, gossip, and laugh about a senator who tried to pay them with theater tickets. If things are slow, they might walk together through the market. Some days they share clients, other days they compete. It's a strange kind of friendship. A little support, a little rivalry, but better than being alone. Afternoon, work picks up mid-afternoon. Things usually get busier. Men leave work. Some sneak away from home. The sun's still up, so it feels a little less seedy, at least to them. If Livia's lucky, she gets invited to a nearby lupaner, where a few rooms are open. The beds are hard, the walls are thin, the painted fresco above the doorway shows too. People in a position that defies modern physics. But hey, it's a roof. She might see 3 or 4 clients in an afternoon, depending on demand. Some are regulars, some are new, some are weird and want to be called Caesar. That happens more than you'd think. If the brothel is full or too expensive to rent space in, she'd bring clients back to her own room, assuming her landlord hasn't locked her out again. Evening. Danger in the darkens, the sun goes down. Things change. The streets get louder, drunker, and more dangerous. Rome didn't have street lights, so torches and lamps flickered in the wind, casting long shadows. Livia might walk with a friend now, for safety. Some men get aggressive after a few cups of wine. Some think not paying is a joke. Some don't. Take no for an answer. That's why many Pr0stitutes carried knives. Small ones, hidden under tunics or in sandals. They didn't always help, but they were better than nothing. Still, evening was prime business time. Soldiers just paid. Merchants just returned from the docks. A good night could double your earnings. A bad night could land you in real danger. Getting paid sort of. Livia tries to get paid up front, always. She learned that the hard way. Most basic services might go for 1-2 sesterces, which wasn't much. Maybe enough for a meal or 2. More exotic requests, that cost more. And some men offered gifts instead of money. A loaf of bread, a bit of wine, even jewelry probably stolen, but rent was due weekly. Clothes were out fast, and Livia's landlord didn't take IOS. Every coin mattered, winding down barely by late night. Livia's back in her room. She wipes her face with a wet cloth, rinses her mouth with wine, no toothpaste here, and lies down on her straw mat. Her back hurts, her feet are swollen. But she's alive. She made a few coins. And tomorrow, she'd do it all again. Maybe. She dreams about owning a small bathhouse one day, or getting out of the Subura, or just sleeping until noon without some guy yelling about fish. But dreams are risky in her world. Safer to just keep going. That's a wrap. So yeah, the daily life of a Roman Pr0stitute wasn't exactly steamy romance. It was long hours, low pay, constant risk, and 0 sick days. But somehow, they survived. Many even found moments of friendship, laughter, or control in a world that gave them very little of either. And that's what makes them so fascinating. They weren't just workers, they were hustlers, survivors, and experts in navigating one of history's most complicated societies. The many faces of Roman S3X work. So far, we've met Livia, wandered through the Subura, and peeked into the daily grind of a Roman Pr0stitute. But here's the thing. Not all S3X workers in ancient Rome lived the same way. In fact, the world of Roman Pr0stitution was like a layered cake, messy, uneven, and full of surprises. There were street walkers, brothel girls, enslaved workers, fancy courtesans, and even S3X workers who performed for the gods. Some worked in public, some worked in secret, some got rich, most didn't. Let's break it down. The streetwalkers, the survival hustlers, these were the most common, and the most vulnerable. Streetwalkers, known as prostibulae, were usually poor, unlicensed, and working outside the official brothel system. They hung around taverns, markets, public toilets, yes, really, and alleys. Some didn't even have rooms, just a doorway or a dark corner. Their rates were rock bottom. Sometimes just a loaf of bread or a coin or two. Many were enslaved, or former slaves. They did what they had to in order to survive. And they were often targets for abuse, theft, or worse. Their clothing was basic, their tools were few, and their days were long. Think of them as the street-level survivors of the Roman world, invisible to most, but everywhere if you looked close enough. The brothel workers, the middle class, then there were the manageresses who worked in lupanars, Rome's official brothels. These women were registered, taxed, and somewhat protected by the system. They worked in small rooms with stone beds, usually under the watchful eye of a lino or lina, basically, a Roman pimp or brothel manager. Some brothels were simple, just a hallway with a few rooms. Others were decorated with erotic paintings and graffiti. The goal was to get customers in, keep them happy, and get them out fast. Brothel workers had slightly more stability than streetwalkers. They might sleep indoors, have regular food, and even form friendships with each other. But they still had to deal with violence, drunk clients, and long hours, and if they were enslaved. Forget rights. They worked until they were sold, injured, or dead. The fancy courtesans, the VIPs. Now here's where it gets interesting. Some S3X workers managed to break away from the brothels and go independent. These were the scorta delicate, the luxurious ones. Think private apartments, wealthy clients, and maybe even personal slaves. They didn't stand on street corners. They sent letters, arranged private meetings, and knew how to charm the rich. Their clients were senators, poets, generals. Their rooms had cushions, wine, and actual lighting. Some even had Greek tutors, because nothing said sexy in Rome like quoting Homer. These courtesans were part of high society. Sort of. They were still outsiders. They couldn't legally marry respectable men, but they had more power than most women in Rome, and some were even immortalized in poetry and scandal. Of course, the line between courtesan and mistress was blurry. Sometimes they played both roles. Sometimes they ended up with real estate, jewelry, and enough money to retire. Sometimes they just got dumped for the next pretty face. Still, if you had to be a S3X worker in Rome, this was probably the tier you wanted. The enslaved workers, no choice at all. Let's not forget, Rome was a slave economy, and many Pr0stitutes were slaves. They didn't choose the job. They were bought for it, raised for it, sold for it. Some were trained in special schools, ludi meretrici, to learn seduction, dancing, and pleasure. Others were simply forced into it young and expected to earn money for their owners. They had no rights, no pay, no control. If they resisted, they could be beaten or killed. If they got pregnant, the child belonged to the owner. It's one of the ugliest parts of Roman S3X culture, and one that was completely normalized at the time. These workers weren't just overlooked. They were treated as objects, replaceable, exhaustible. And yet, some still managed to carve out small moments of power, using charm, cleverness, or quiet rebellion. It wasn't much, but it was something. The sacred S3X workers, yes, that was a thing. Romans were weirdly comfortable mixing religion and S3X. In some temples, especially those to Venus, the goddess of love. They were women and sometimes men who served through ritual S3X acts. It wasn't common in the later Republic and Empire, but earlier on and in parts of the provinces. Sacred Pr0stitution was a real practice. It wasn't exactly a job you applied for. Some were dedicated by their families, some were enslaved, and some believed it was an honor to serve the gods this way. Clients would offer donations to the temple. In return, they'd get blessed in the back room, and people say church is boring. The gender benders, not just women. Not all Roman Pr0stitutes were women. Male Pr0stitutes existed too, and not just for female clients. Young male slaves, pueri, were often sold into S3X work, so were saniti, Men who took on a feminine role and were often mocked in Roman writing, but were definitely part of the scene. They were also cross-dressers, dancers, and performers who offered more specialized services. Roman society was deeply patriarchal, so it wasn't about who you slept with, but how you did it. As long as a Roman man was dominant, it was considered fine, but being on the receiving end, that's where they drew the line, with a lot of judgment and name-calling. We'll dive deeper into this in Chapter 14, but for now, just know the industry was diverse and complicated. So many faces, same city from alleyways to palace, bedrooms, from temple rituals to bathhouse whispers. S3X work in Rome wasn't one size fits all. It was a whole spectrum, a social system hidden in plain sight. Some workers were free. Some weren't. Some were rich. Most were poor. Some were loved. Many were forgotten. But they all played a part in keeping the gears of Roman society turning, even if no one wanted to admit it. Brothels, baths, and back alleys asterisk all right. So now we know who the Roman S3X workers were. But where did all the action happen? Spoiler, it wasn't always behind closed doors. Rome wasn't shy about its pleasure industry. In fact, you could trip over a brothel if you weren't watching where you walked. Some were official buildings. Others were basically just storage closets with dreams. Some were open during the day. Others never closed. And then there were the bathhouses, the back alleys, and even the stairwells. Yep, no place was really off-limits. Today, we're taking a tour. So toss on your sandals, ignore the fish guts in the gutter, and let's stroll through the steamy side of ancient Rome, the Lupanar. Rome's classic brothel. Let's start with the main attraction. The Lupanar, literally Wolf Den. Pr0stitutes were called she-wolves, so the name kinda fits. These places were the fast food joints of the Roman pleasure world. Cheap, quick, and everywhere. The most famous one is in Pompeii. You can still visit it today if you're into history and extremely uncomfortable murals. It has 10 tiny rooms with stone beds, all lined up in a hallway. The ceilings are low, the walls are thick, and the doors, there were no doors, just curtains. If you were lucky. Above each doorway was a little fresco showing different S3X positions, like an ancient menu. One option number 3. Just point. The rooms weren't made for comfort. A thin mattress, a lamp, maybe a small stool. Privacy, not really. Romance, definitely not. But it got the job done. What brothels looked like? Most Lupanars followed the same design. A narrow entrance off a busy street, a small lobby or hallway with doorways on both sides, graffiti everywhere. Names, prices, insults, jokes. A backroom for the manager, a Lino or Lena, to count money or keep records. Maybe a second floor, where workers slept or kept working. The walls were often decorated with faded paintings. Nothing subtle. Think of it like Roman adult wallpaper. It wasn't meant to set the mood. It was more like advertising. And the smell. Probably a mix of sweat, wine, oil lamps, and regret. Some brothels even had a fountain out front, not for beauty, but to clean up afterward. Hygiene was loose. The graffiti tells all want to know what really went down in these places. Just read the walls. Pompeii's brothels are covered in graffiti. Some of it's hilarious, some of it's filthy. Most of it's both. Here are a few real translations. I had the best time with Maritima, twice. Lucius was here and had a great night. Gaius kisses like a donkey. Whoever reads this is an idiot. Classic. There were also price lists scribbled in the corners. To asses for a good time, or special for soldiers. 3 for the price of 2. Clients bragged, workers advertised, and people just couldn't resist writing on the walls. Human nature never changes. The bathhouses, squeaky clean. And not so much. Next stop, the Thermae, or Roman bathhouses. These weren't brothels, technically. But if you were looking for something extra, this was the place to be. Bathhouses were the social hub of Roman life. People bathed, gossiped, exercised, and yes, hooked up. There were separate rooms for hot, cold, and warm baths. Big open pools, steam, massage oils, and behind the scenes. A whole lot of whispering, negotiating, and flirting. Some S3X workers hung around the entrances, others worked inside. Some bathhouse staff even doubled as Pr0stitutes. Slaves, especially young boys, were often forced into it. The baths were a mix of hygiene, business, and pleasure. You might leave smelling better, or just more suspicious. Back alleys, stairs, and shadows that everyone could afford to rent a room in a lupainer. And not every client wanted to be seen. That's where the alleys and stairwells came in. Many Pr0stitutes worked out of doorways, under arches, or even in stairwells of apartment buildings called insulae. Some carried little stools with them, others just leaned against the wall. These setups were quick, dirty, and cheap. But they were also risky. No manager, no guards. Just you, a client, and the possibility of getting robbed or worse. But when you're broke and hungry, you don't wait for ideal conditions. You work where the clients are, and the clients love the shadows, home offices, solo setups, and Pr0stitutes, especially independent ones, worked out of their own homes. They might rent a tiny room or even live above a shop and keep their door open during business hours. They'd hang a small oil lamp outside the door to show they were available, kind of like flipping on the open sign. This setup offered a bit more safety and privacy, but also less foot traffic. Fewer clients meant higher prices, and not everyone could afford that. Still, if a S3X worker had a loyal group of regulars, this was a decent way to make a living, or at least avoid the chaos of the streets, lighting, sounds, and smells. Let's talk ambience. You might be imagining candlelight, soft music, and the scent of lavender. Yeah, no, lighting came from smoky oil lamps or torches. The air smelled like sweat, oil, wine, urine, and overcooked meat. The sounds, grunts, laughter, snoring, arguments, footsteps, and the occasional donkey braying outside. The atmosphere wasn't romantic. It was functional, businesslike, and often kind of gross. But for Romans, this was just part of life. They weren't trying to create a mood. They were trying to get through the day. From the elite to the gutter, brothels came in tiers. Some catered to sailors and laborers. Others served senators in secret. Some were just holes in the wall. Others had frescoes and fountains. But no matter the setup, the job was the same. And for most S3X workers, the surroundings were just background, noise. The real challenge was surviving the clients, the law, and the grind. The price of pleasure asterisk. All right, we've talked about the people, the places, and the tools of the trade. Now it's time to talk about the money. Because in ancient Rome, just like today, S3X wasn't free. It wasn't always expensive, either. But it came with a price. Whether you were a tired soldier looking for 10 minutes of distraction, or a senator in search of a luxurious evening, you had to pay up. So how much did Roman Pr0stitutes actually charge? What did you get for your money? And who could afford what? Grab your sesterces. We're going shopping. Roman money basics. Don't worry. It's quick. Before we talk prices, here's a super quick crash course in Roman coins. As the lowest value coin, think of it like a penny. Sestertius. Sesters, for asses, and yes, jokes were made. Denarius, the big one, worth about 16 asses or 4 sesterces. Aureus, a gold coin, super valuable. Only rich folks saw these. To give you some context, a loaf of bread equals approximately 1 as a cheap cup of wine equals 1 to 2 asses. A soldier's daily wage equals around 1 denarius. Oh, now, let's see what S3X cost in that world. The cheap stuff, quick and dirty. At the bottom of the price ladder were the streetwalkers and brothel girls who charged just 1 to 2 asses. That's right, A visit to a Pr0stitute could cost less than a loaf of bread. For that price, you didn't get candlelight and conversation. You got speed, zero privacy, and maybe a stone bed if you were lucky. But for a lot of Roman men, soldiers, laborers, farmers in town for the day, that was enough. Some workers even offered discounts to regulars, or bulk deals. Buy two, get one free was probably not a thing. But who knows? Mid-range options, a bit more for a bit more if you had a little extra money. Say, a few sesterces, you could go to a nicer brothel or hire a more experienced worker. For 4 to 8 sesterces, you might get a cleaner room with a door, even a choice of position. Yep, that was a thing. Slightly more time, possibly a drink or snack afterwards. Some brothels advertised their rates with paintings or graffiti on the wall. Others let clients negotiate, and if you were a regular who tipped, well, you might even get priority service. It wasn't luxury, but it wasn't rock bottom either. The high-end stuff for the rich and bereaved. No, let's talk about the VIP experience. If you were wealthy, like owns a villa and a bathing slave wealthy, you could hire a courtesan or luxury companion for a whole evening, or even multiple days. Prices here weren't fixed. It depended on the worker's reputation, beauty, skills, and connections. But we're talking dozens or even hundreds of sesterces, possibly several denarii per session. What did you get? Private settings sometimes in their home, or even yours, wine, food, music, conversation, a partner who was witty, educated, and knew how to flatter your ego, be even someone to sing you a song or recite a poem. After some clients develop long-term relationships with these high-end workers, they weren't just buying S3X, they were buying an experience. Or at least someone who pretended to care for a few hours, who could afford it. Let's break it down by class: poor laborers and soldiers, the 1-2 as streetwalkers, quick, cheap, and often in alleyways or public latrines. Craftsmen and merchants, the mid-range, they could afford a brothel visit after work, maybe once or twice a week. Wealthy citizens and officials, full access. Courtesans, companions, house calls, and even live-in mistresses. Slaves couldn't pay, but some masters rented out their enslaved people for others to use, which was horrifying but legal. S3X work in Rome was technically open to everyone. But like everything else, money shaped the experience, pricing by time and service. Some Pr0stitutes charged by the act, others by the hour, and some had tiered pricing, depending on what the client wanted. Want something standard? That's a few asses. Want something weird? That's extra. Want me to pretend to like you? That's double. There wasn't a menu like at a restaurant, but the negotiation was usually quick and blunt. Romans weren't shy about this stuff. Some clients tried to haggle. Some offered gifts instead of money: bread, wine, cheap jewelry. Whether that work depended on the worker and how desperate they were that day. What about tips? Tips weren't mandatory, but if you were a good tipper, you stood out. Some workers even wrote graffiti about their favorite clients. Lucius always pays well. Marcus, bring better wine next time. Felix is cheap and smells like fish. Your reputation mattered, not just among the workers, but among other clients too. Word got around. When payment went wrong, not everyone paid what they owed. Some clients ran off. Some promised to come back later. Others tried to pay in food. I owe us, or false promises. Pr0stitutes didn't have a great legal system to protect them, unless they were registered. Even then, they had to hope someone cared enough to enforce the law. That's why many demanded payment up front. No coin, no service. Some also kept friends nearby, or worked in pairs, to avoid getting stiffed. But it happened a lot. And sometimes the only way to get paid was to chase a client down the street while yelling insults. It was not a glamorous life. Pleasure, profit, And survival for Roman S3X workers, pricing wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. Every coin meant food, shelter, or safety. And every client was a risk, not just physically, but financially. Would they pay? Would they be violent? Would they steal your wig and run? There was no steady paycheck, no job security, just your charm, your hustle, and your ability to read people fast. Tools of the trade asterisk. All right, you've walked through the streets of ancient Rome, peeked inside the brothels, and met some of the people doing the work. But now it's time to talk about style? Yep, even in ancient Rome, Pr0stitutes had a look, and that look mattered. When your job depends on getting noticed in a crowd of togas and tunics, you've got to stand out. So, how did Roman S3X workers advertise themselves without handing out flyers or posting on ancient Instagram? Let's talk clothes, makeup, wigs, body language, and some surprisingly clever tactics. Dress to impress or at least to stand out. Roman Pr0stitutes weren't allowed to dress like respectable women. In fact, some laws even required them to dress in a way that marked them as different. Many wore brightly colored tunics, oranges, reds, yellows, anything that popped. The average Roman woman wore pale, modest tones, but S3X workers wanted to catch the eye. Think of it like wearing neon in a world of beige. Some even wore togas, which is wild, because togas were usually for men. But in a twist of fashion irony, women who wore togas were seen as shameless, unladylike, and openly available. So naturally, some Pr0stitutes adopted the look to scream, "I'm not here to knit." Their outfits were usually short, loose, and designed to reveal, just enough, subtle, not the goal. Makeup, the bolder, the better. Forget natural beauty. Roman Pr0stitutes went full glam, or at least as close as they could with what they had. They used white lead paste to lighten their faces. Yes, it was toxic, but it looked fashionable. Red ochre or wine dregs for blush and lipstick. Soot or charcoal to line their eyes. Powdered minerals or crushed beetles to add shimmer. Their goal: be impossible to ignore. Heavy makeup was frowned upon for respectable women, but for Pr0stitutes, it was part of the job. The more painted up you looked, the more likely a client would think, "Ah, she's working." And hey, if it hides a rough night or makes your cheekbones pop, why not? Wigs. Wig share was a big deal. Roman women spent hours on it, curling, braiding, pinning. But Pr0stitutes took it to another level. Wigs were all the rage. Some made of human hair, some from goat, some from who knows what, blonde. Wigs were especially popular because blonde hair was associated with Germans and Gauls, and Romans thought that was exotic. So imagine a brunette Roman woman throwing on a platinum blonde wig, smudging some charcoal around her eyes, and heading out into the night. Instant transformation. Wigs also made it easier to clean up, hide bald spots, or change your look fast. And in a business where first impressions mattered, that could make or break your next meal. Signs and signals without social media, websites, or business cards. Roman S3X workers had to get creative. Many used lanterns. A small oil lamp outside the door was a classic open for business sign. Others used hand gestures, body language, or even positioning. Standing in a certain doorway, wearing a certain scarf, or flashing a quick glance could be all it took. Experienced clients knew the signals. In some brothels, there were even frescoes above the doors showing different positions or specialties, like an ancient menu. It let clients know what to expect. And if you were feeling bold, just shout. Streetwalkers were known to call out offers, especially in busy markets or near taverns. Jewelry and scent, if you could afford it. Not every S3X worker had jewelry, but those who did wore it like armor. A flashy necklace or some jangly bracelets made you look more desirable and maybe a little more expensive. Some even wore anklets, which weren't super common in respectable Roman fashion, but had a flirty edge. As for perfume, That was a luxury. Real perfume was expensive, imported, and made from flowers, spices, or resins. A little dab could go a long way in covering up the less glamorous smells of the street. Cheaper alternatives included rubbing olive oil with herbs on the skin. Not exactly Chanel, no. 5. But better than nothing. The pose matters: posture, expression, attitude. It all sent a message. Standing confidently, leaning just the right way, making eye contact. These were the Instagram poses of the Roman world. Some workers learned how to tilt their heads, raise their eyebrows, or smile just enough to attract without looking desperate. Some even practiced laughing or walking a certain way. It wasn't about being real. It was about being noticed. You're not just selling a service. You're selling a fantasy. And Romans loved a good illusion. Paperwork and public records. Let's not forget the most bureaucratic accessory of all, a license. At certain points in Roman history, especially under emperors like Augustus, Pr0stitutes were required to register with the authorities. This meant going to the edile, a type of Roman official, and declaring your name, status, and profession. Once registered, your name might be recorded publicly. Some even had their names carved on plaques outside brothels. Not exactly great for privacy. Why bother? Well, if you were registered, you were technically protected under Roman law. You had the right to get paid, in theory, and the empire got to collect taxes from you. Win-win, right? Unless you preferred to work under the radar, which many did. Style, strategy, and survival in the end. All these tools, clothes, makeup, wigs, jewelry, gestures, were more than just fashion. They were survival strategies. Roman Pr0stitutes had to be saleswomen, stylists, performers, and bodyguards, all in one. Looking good wasn't just about vanity. It was about food, rent, and not getting ignored in a crowd full of competition. And, maybe, just maybe, it gave them a small sense of control in a world that didn't offer them much. Fame, shame, and social rank. So, you've put on your brightest wig, done your best Cleopatra eyeliner, and made it through another day in ancient Rome as a Pr0stitute. You've got a handful of coins, a sore back, and maybe a funny story or two. But here's the big question. What does society think of you? The answer: it's complicated, and also a bit ridiculous. Roman society loved S3X. Roman society also loved judging people for it. Especially women, especially poor women, especially poor women trying to survive by using the one asset society wouldn't let them not be defined by. So let's break it down. How Rome treated its S3X workers, the fame, the shame, the weird double standards, and why being a Pr0stitute in Rome meant constantly walking a social tightrope. First things first, your infamia is showing in Roman law. Pr0stitutes were officially labeled with something called infamia. It sounds like infamy, and that's basically what it was. Once you were known to be a S3X worker, or registered as one, you lost certain legal protections. You were seen as dishonorable, not criminal, just shameful. Here's what infamia meant. You couldn't testify in court as a credible witness. You couldn't inherit property. You couldn't marry into certain families. You couldn't wear respectable clothing in public. People were legally allowed to insult you. Yep, that was a thing. It was like having a scarlet letter stapled to your name, permanently. But the double standards were real. No, here's where it gets unfair. Or, well, even more unfair. Men who visited Pr0stitutes, no problem. Men who kept mistresses or visited brothels daily, totally fine. But women who worked in the profession, socially ruined. Even women who were forced into S3X work, like enslaved girls sold into brothels, were treated with the same shame. People didn't care how you got there, just that you were there. And yet, the clients kept coming. Roman writers would rant about how immoral Pr0stitutes were, then write entire books about their favorite courtesans. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. Writers, gossip, and ancient Yelp reviews Pr0stitutes were talked about constantly in Roman literature, usually with a mix of fascination and scorn. Some examples: Plautus, the playwright, filled his comedies with Pr0stitutes who were clever, funny, and always outsmarting the men. Juvenal, the satirist, raged about how Roman men were addicted to pleasure and couldn't resist a well-dressed streetwalker. Ovid, the poet of love, wrote flirtatious poems about women who might have been working girls or just really enjoyed attention. Pr0stitutes even showed up in graffiti. Some were praised. Felicia is the best in the Suburra. Others, not so much. Don't trust Lupa. She steals sandals. It was the ancient version of online reviews. Brutal and weirdly honest, from shame to stage. Some Pr0stitutes became celebrities. Believe it or not, a few S3X workers actually became famous in Rome. Take Cytheris, a freedwoman and former slave who became the mistress of the politician Mark Antony. Yep, the same guy who dated Cleopatra. She acted in plays, performed in public, and hung out with the elite. Or Volumnius Cytheris, another courtesan who was so well known that poets wrote love poems about her. Some called her the muse of Rome's vices. These women didn't have high status, technically, but they had influence, power, fans, and they knew how to use it. Of course, it was rare. Most Pr0stitutes didn't get poems. They got glares. But for a lucky few, fame brought a kind of social armor and a chance to rise above the shame. Home life. What home life? If you were a Pr0stitute, especially a registered one, you weren't seen as marriage material. Respectable Roman men wouldn't marry S3X workers. It was considered disgraceful. Even if the woman was beautiful, kind, and smarter than everyone else in the room, nope. Too much infamia. That meant most Pr0stitutes didn't have stable home lives, no husbands, no families that welcomed them back. And if they had children, which many did, those kids often had a hard time being accepted, too. Some retired workers tried to settle down, open a tavern, raise a family, disappear into the suburbs. But society didn't forget. That label stuck. Did anyone defend them? A few philosophers and writers tried to argue that Pr0stitutes were a necessary part of society. The philosopher Musonius Rufus, kind of like the Roman version of a grumpy TED Talk speaker, said that Roman men should control their desires and stop relying on Pr0stitutes. Some doctors and priests even said brothels helped protect respectable women by keeping men's urges occupied elsewhere. Yikes. But no one really stood up for the women themselves. There were no unions, no protections, no rights movements, just survival, the occasional twist, worship, and the sacred. Here's a weird little twist. In some parts of the Roman world, S3X work was tied to religion. In ancient Corinth, a Greek city under Roman control, some temples of Aphrodite allegedly had sacred Pr0stitutes, women who served the goddess by sleeping with worshippers in exchange for offerings. We don't know how common this was, and it may have been exaggerated, but it shows how confusing and contradictory Roman attitudes were. In one breath, they'd worship a S3X goddess. In the next, they'd throw rocks at a STRETWALK. Classic Rome. The bottom line: everyone used them. No one respected them. Being a Pr0stitute in ancient Rome meant living in the shadows of a society that needed you, used you, but refused to respect you. You could be famous. You could be rich. You could even be loved. But you could never fully belong, unless you were lucky enough to buy your way out, change your name, and disappear. Your job followed you for life. The men behind the curtain. Okay. So far we've talked a lot about the women, the Pr0stitutes of ancient Rome, their lives, their work, their prices, their status. But what about the men? Because while Rome's S3X industry was full of women doing the work, men were the ones mostly pulling the strings, managing, owning, using, and judging the entire system, often at the same time. So who were these guys? Let's pull back the curtain and meet the pimps, landlords, brothel owners, creepy clients, and other shady figures who made a living off the backs of women, sometimes literally. It's not pretty, but it's important. Meet the Lino, Rome's classic pimp in Roman times. The most notorious figure in the S3X trade was the Lino, plural, Linones. This guy was the ancient equivalent of a pimp, and no, the Romans didn't try to sugarcoat it. Everyone hated the Lino, even other sleazy people. He was seen as greedy, cruel, manipulative, and completely lacking in honor, even among criminals. Roman playwrights loved using him as a stock villain. In almost every play, the Lino is selling someone into slavery, lying to clients, taking all the money, and eventually getting tricked, beaten, or humiliated by the hair. Basically, the audience loved to hate him. What did the Lino actually do? The Lino's job was to own and control Pr0stitutes, usually enslaved women, sometimes freed women in desperate situations. He'd buy girls from slave markets, train them. Yes, it's as gross as it sounds. Set the prices, take all or most of the profits, enforce rules with violence or threats, rent rooms, guards, and Supplice might run a brothel, or he might just rent out girls to clients in alleyways or taverns. Either way, he got rich, and the women, they got not much. The law technically allowed him to do this, even encouraged it, as long as he paid taxes, but morally, even ancient Romans thought it was messed up. The brothel owner. Business before pleasure. Not every man involved in Pr0stitution was a Lino. Some were just business-minded landlords. These guys might own the building, rent out rooms by the hour, take a cut from the workers, or the pimp provide wine, food, or entertainment, pay off local guards to leave them alone. It was more like running a sketchy motel with extras. And because brothels were usually in busy areas like near markets or bathhouses, they made a lot of money. Some owners weren't even involved in the S3X trade directly, they just let others use their space. I don't know what goes on in there, officer. Sure, buddy, the bodyguards and bouncers, some brothels, especially the nicer ones, hired doormen or guards, their job. Keep clients from getting violent, kick out drunks, break up fights between jealous customers, watch over the money in lower-end places. Workers sometimes had to pay these guys just to avoid being harassed by them. So, not exactly a dream job environment. The tavern keeper, believe it or not, a lot of Roman S3X work happened in taverns, not just brothels. Taverns were where working-class Romans relaxed, ate, drank, gambled, and looked for company. Some tavern owners also acted as pimps, others just rented space to Pr0stitutes who worked independently or in pairs. Either way, if you ran a bar, you knew what was going on in the back room, and you got a cut. Fun fact, one of the slang terms for a Pr0stitute in Rome was copa, the same word used for a tavern waitress. The line was blurry. The government's role. Yes, Rome taxeth. Roman government didn't try to shut down the S3X trade. It just wanted its cut. In the Empire period, Emperor Caligula, yes, that Caligula introduced a prostitution tax. Every registered Pr0stitute had to pay it, based on what they charged. This meant someone had to keep records, inspect the brothels, collect the money. We don't know exactly who did that job, but it was probably some very uncomfortable bureaucrat with a clipboard walking into a room full of awkward eye contact. The state didn't protect workers, but it sure cashed in on them. The clients, everyone from slaves to senators. No, let's talk about the customers. Roman men of all ranks visited Pr0stitutes. Some were lonely soldiers, drunken teenagers, overworked merchants, creepy politicians, bored poets, powerful generals. Pretending to slum it. Clients could be charming, or awful, or just clueless. The one thing they all had in common, they didn't get judged for it. You could be the most respected man in the Senate and still frequent brothels. No one cared. If a woman did the same thing, even once, her reputation was done forever. The lies they told themselves did all these men tell themselves. Probably something like this. It's not real cheating. She enjoys it. I'm helping her by giving her money. Everyone does it. I'm a good client. Sound familiar? Some even thought they were romantically involved. They'd get jealous, or write poems, or show up drunk and demanding attention. Meanwhile, the women were just trying to survive another shift, power, profit, and pretending get the end of the day. The men behind Rome's S3X industry held the power. They made the rules, they took the profits, and they decided what was acceptable for everyone but themselves. It was a system full of contradictions. S3X was everywhere, but virtue was demanded. Women were shamed for what men paid for. P1MPs were mocked in plays, but rich. In real life, clients pretended they were lovers, not users, and the whole thing kept rolling, generation after generation. Lovers, stalkers, and sugar daddies. So, picture this. You're a Roman Pr0stitute, doing your thing. Maybe in a tavern, maybe in a brothel, maybe just standing by a public fountain with your best sultry look. And then this guy shows up. Again. For like the 5th time this week, he says he's in love with you. He writes you bad poetry. He thinks you're more than just a Pr0stitute. But he still refuses to pay full price. Welcome to the weird and messy world of client relationships in ancient Rome, where things got romantic, obsessive, manipulative, and downright confusing. Let's dive into the hearts and wallets of Rome's ancient sugar daddies, delusional lovers, and poetic stalkers. Love in the time of coin purses. Roman Pr0stitutes weren't supposed to fall in love, and clients weren't supposed to expect anything beyond, well, the service they paid for. But humans are humans, and ancient Romans, dramatic. So things got complicated fast. Clients developed crushes. Some genuinely fell in love. Others just thought they were in love with the fantasy they'd created in their heads. Pr0stitutes learned quickly how to handle it. Smile and flirt equals more tips. Pretend to care equals return customers. Play hard to get equals men spent more. It was a dangerous game. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it got out of hand. The poets were the worst. If you ever read Roman poetry and thought, wow, this guy's obsessed, you were right. Take Ovid, the famous love poet. In his Amores, he writes about a woman named Corinna, beautiful, mysterious, and very possibly a Pr0stitute or courtesan. He writes about sneaking into her room, watching her sleep, even spying on her through doors. Romantic? Maybe. Creepy? Definitely. Then there's Pr0stitutes, who was madly in love with a woman named Cynthia, who may also have been a working girl. He writes about how jealous he is, how much he spends on her, how much he suffers. These guys acted like they were dating these women. But they weren't. They were customers, and deep down, they knew it. I'll rescue you. Some rich clients went full knight in shining tunic and tried to save their favorite girls from Pr0stituti on. They single quotes D offer to pay off her debts, buy her freedom if she was enslaved, set her up in a nice apartment, give her jewelry and clothes, promise to marry her. They rarely did. Sometimes this worked. A Pr0stitute could leave the profession, become a man's mistress, maybe even his wife, though that was extremely rare. Other times, it was just manipulation. A client dangled hope like a carrot, and the girl stayed loyal for years, waiting for a new life that never came. When clients got weird, not all lovers were sweet talkers. Some were full-on stalkers. They'd follow the women around, show up uninvited, threaten violence if they saw her with another man. And since Pr0stitutes had no legal rights, remember, infamia, there wasn't much they could do. Some girls had bodyguards. Some carried knives. Most just learned how to read a man's mood faster than he could open his coin pouch. One line from a Roman poem warns about the man who says he loves you, but pays you less each time. Yeah, that guy was everywhere, but I've spent so much on you. Some clients kept track, like ancient accountants of romance. They'd say things like, "I've spent 200 sesterces on you this month. I bought you that red wig. I've brought you grapes and wine 3 times this week. I could have had the girls for that price." It's the Roman version of nice guys finish last. They thought spending money meant they deserved love, or loyalty, or exclusivity. To the women, it just meant, great. Rent is paid for another week. Real feelings. Some teams were their real relationships, probably. Not many, but they happened. Some Pr0stitutes really did fall for their clients, and some clients truly tried to treat them well, with kindness, respect, even love. There are stories of freed women marrying former clients and building stable lives together. One tombstone was found with an inscription from a man to his late wife that read, "To my beloved, once a courtesan, always my heart." That's rare, but it's sweet, and it shows that not everything was just business. Still, most of the time, the power balance made it hard for anything truly equal to grow. Love, business, or both. In the Roman world, the line between romance and transaction was thin. A courtesan might pretend to be in love, just to keep the client spending. A client might pretend he wasn't paying, just to feel better about himself. Both might pretend they had a real connection, while keeping one eye on the money. This wasn't unique to Rome, of course, but the lack of rights, the legal shame, and the performative nature of Roman masculinity made the situation extra awkward. A man couldn't openly say, "I'm in love with a Pr0stitute." That was unmanly, but he could write 30 poems about her and call it art. A note on names: you may have noticed, Roman Pr0stitutes often had names like Cytheris, Delicia, Lupa, or Flora. Sometimes these were real names, sometimes just stage names. They helped create a character, a brand, if you will. A woman could switch identities, play a role, and keep her real life private. Clients often didn't know the real person behind the performance, and some didn't want to. They weren't in love with her, they were in love with the idea of her. Love in a brothel is still a business at the end of the day. Ancient Roman Pr0stitutes were experts at surviving. Some used affection to earn more money. Some used fake love to keep themselves safe. Some even believed in the romance, at least for a little while. But for most, the brothel wasn't a love story. It was a job. And love, if it came at all, had to wait until the end of the shift. The provinces and the countryside. All right, we've spent a lot of time in Rome's busy streets, shadowy taverns, and rowdy brothels. But the Roman Empire was huge, from the rainy hills of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, and Pr0stitution. It didn't stop at the city gates. In this chapter, we're heading out of the capital and into the countryside, small towns, and remote provinces, to see what S3X work looked like outside of Rome, because not every Roman Pr0stitute worked in a marble city. Some worked in dusty villages, along lonely highways, or in military camps full of bored, homesick soldiers. Let's take a quiet walk through the empire's backroads and see who we meet. Life on the frontier. The Roman army didn't just conquer territory, it also brought with it roads, forts, latrines, and, of course, brothels. Wherever you found soldiers, you found S3X work. It wasn't officially allowed inside military forts, but let's be honest, that rule got broken faster than a clay amphora at a frat party. Pr0stitutes would set up near army camps, working in pop-up taverns, bathhouses, roadside inns, makeshift tents, or wagons. Some were locals. Others followed the troops. A few even became unofficial wives, cooking, cleaning, and keeping the soldiers company. The army pretended not to notice. As long as the men stayed loyal to Rome, everyone looked the other way. A map of Desiri outside Rome. Pr0stitution followed a very familiar pattern. You'd find it along highways, especially near way stations called mutations, where travelers changed horses. Some inns even advertised extra services with symbols carved into stone. Near temples. Yes, some temples had nearby holy women offering divine comfort. The line between worship and pleasure was sometimes intentionally blurry. In market towns, where farmers came in to sell crops and animals, after a hard day of selling cabbages, a little wine and company wasn't uncommon. Seaports and river docks, where sailors blew all their wages in a single night. If people gathered there, chances are, so did the oldest profession, country brothels. Less glam, more greed. A countryside brothel was nothing like the big city ones in Pompeii or Rome. No fancy frescoes, no menus on the wall, no Greek poetry quotes over the door. Instead, you probably find a small house with 3 or 4 rooms, straw mattresses, a fire pit for heating wine, be a goat or 2 walking around. Some were run by families, others by ex-soldiers. A few were just taverns with a couple of back rooms. They weren't luxurious, but they did the job. For locals and travelers alike, rural workers, rural waggons in the provinces, prices were lower, and choices were fewer. Many of the women who worked in the countryside were former slaves, widows, or poor farmers' daughters trying to survive. Some worked part-time, during harvest seasons or festivals. Others were more permanent fixtures, known by name in the village. Clients were mostly locals, farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, or passing merchants. There were fewer coins changing hands, and a lot more bartering. Yes, sometimes payment was in bread, wine, wool, firewood, even eggs. 3x trade may have been ancient, but it was also deeply practical. The village girl fantasy in Roman literature. There's a common trope, the innocent country girl who's corrupted by city life or S3X work. Writers loved this image, a sweet, fresh-faced girl from the provinces lured into a brothel by big city temptation. In reality, most rural Pr0stitutes were tough, smart, and used to hard work. They didn't fall into the job by accident. They chose it because it paid better than weaving baskets or herding sheep. Still, that fantasy persisted. Even Roman men in the provinces sometimes preferred foreign girls, like Gauls, Syrians, or Nubians, just to feel exotic. The paper trail. There aren't as many written records about rural Pr0stitution. Most inscriptions and graffiti come from cities. But archaeologists have found brothel-style buildings, suggestive art, and even price lists carved into stone from places like Trier, Germany, Londinium, London, Ephesus, Turkey, Lugdunum, France. The trade was everywhere. It just looked different depending on where you were. Less law, less protection in small towns. There were fewer officials to enforce rules, which was a blessing and a curse. On one hand, no nosy tax collectors, no strict registration, more freedom to work independently. On the flip side, no protection from violent clients, no access to healers or midwives, more likely to be exploited or abandoned in cities. A Pr0stitute could disappear in the crowd. In a village, everyone knew your business. Privacy was a luxury, and so was safety. When the brothel was the town in some tiny outposts, the local brothel wasn't just a business, it was the town's unofficial hub. People gathered there not just for S3X, but for gossip, music, drinks, and dice games. It was like the Roman version of a dive bar, only more intimate. A Pr0stitute in one of these places might know everyone's secrets, act as a kind of therapist, keep drunk men from fighting, cook soup, and pour wine between clients. She was more than just a worker. She was part of the community. For better or worse, quiet lives, loud stories. Working in the countryside didn't mean life was easier, but it was different. There were fewer customers, fewer rules, and fewer choices, but also, sometimes, more dignity. In a small village, a woman could build a reputation, have regulars, make a life. She might not be rich, she might not be free, but she might have something that many urban workers never got, a sense of home, retirement, respectability, and reinvention. So, you've been working the Roman streets or baths, or taverns, or army camps for years. You've seen things, You've done things. You survived. But now you're tired. Your feet hurt. Your clients are getting younger, and you're not. And the wine isn't helping anymore. What next? In this chapter, we're looking at what happened at the job. If you were a Roman Pr0stitute ready to hang up your stola and find a new life. Was that even possible? Surprisingly, yes, sometimes. Let's take a quiet walk through the twilight. Years of Rome's working girls. Do Roman Pr0stitutes ever retire? Short answer, not often. Longer answer, it depended. If a woman was enslaved and forced into Pr0stitution, she could only stop if she was freed by her owner she bought. Her own freedom, or she escaped, not recommended if she was free but broke. Retirement wasn't really an option. She kept working until she physically couldn't, but some women, especially the clever, lucky, or well-connected ones, managed to get out. Here's how. Step 1. Save your sister says the first step to retirement in Rome was money. No social security, no pensions, no thanks for your years of service. So smart workers stashed away coins, often secretly, since many brothel keepers or pimps took a cut of everything. Some managed to, by their own home, open a tavern setup, a small shop like selling perfume or combs, or even start their own brothel. Hey, at least they were the boss. Now there's an inscription from a woman named Restituta, who proudly says she worked in the S3X trade, saved up, and eventually owned the building she used to work in. Now that's a career arc. Step 2. Find a husband. Maybe it wasn't common, but some Pr0stitutes got married. Not just to anyone. Usually to former clients, other freed people, or older men looking for a companion who already knew how to manage a household and, let's be honest, Roman law technically allowed freed women, even those with infamia, to marry. But there were social consequences. They couldn't marry senators. Their kids might be considered illegitimate. Gossipy neighbors would never let them forget their past. Still, for many women, marriage offered safety, respect, and a place in society beyond that girl from the brothel. Step 3. Write your legacy. Literally, here's a strange but beautiful Roman custom. Even the humblest people loved a good tombstone. Some Pr0stitutes who made it out of the trade left behind inscriptions telling their story. One says, "Here lies Fabia, once a girl of the night, later a wife, always a friend." Another says, "To Lucia, who worked hard, laughed louder, and saved more than her master ever knew." These small stones told the world, I was here. I mattered. I did what I had to do. Reinvention and rebranding in the big cities. Reinvention was harder. People remembered you. Whispers followed you. But in the provinces, or if you moved to a new town, you could start fresh. Some women changed their names. Went from Lupa to Lucilla. Some posed as widows. Some became healers, cooks, or midwives. A few even became respected matrons in local communities. No one the wiser. And for others, reinvention didn't mean pretending they hadn't worked, just that they weren't working anymore. Freed women and legal freedom. If a Pr0stitute was enslaved, freedom changed everything. Legally and socially, some were freed by generous clients. Others bought their own manumission. Once freed, they became liberté. Freed women, with the right to own property, make contracts to, and be sued, leave inheritance. This gave them real power. Some freed women became successful business owners, especially if they stayed connected to old clients or former masters. But even with freedom, infamia stuck to their reputation like olive oil on a toga. Respect wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned, fought for, and defended. Retirement isn't always the end. Here's something interesting. Some Pr0stitutes didn't stop working. They just shifted roles. A few became brothel keepers, Lena's madams, managing younger workers, matchmakers for local men looking for discreet flings, or even trainers, teaching younger women the tricks of the trade. Literally, in some ways, this was retirement Roman style. Less physical labor, more talking, managing, and sipping wine while watching the next generation hustle, growing old in the shadows. Let's not sugarcoat it. Many Pr0stitutes didn't get a happy ending. Without money, connections, or protection, aging in the Roman world was brutal. There were no nursing homes, no retirement plans, just fading eyesight, cold winters, and fading memories of better days. Some women ended up in temples begging for alms. Others were taken in by fellow workers, and a few just disappeared from the records, like most people in history. But some made it. They got out, they rested, they lit lamps in their own homes and didn't have to answer to anyone ever again who deserved respect. The real question wasn't just whether a woman could leave Pr0stitution. It was whether she'd ever be seen as worthy again. Roman society had a short memory when it came to glory, but a long one for shame. Yet the tombstones, poems, and whispers left behind suggest something quietly powerful. Some women earned respect, not by pretending they'd never worked, but by surviving it, owning it, and still finding peace. Religion, ritual, and sacred S3X*. All right. We've talked about the streets, the soldiers, the brothels, the baths. But now we're heading somewhere holier, or at least, somewhere that smells more like incense than sweat. Let's talk about religion and Pr0stitution in ancient Rome, because the Romans were a spiritual bunch. They had gods for everything: doors Janus, boundaries Terminus, sewers Clocina, and of course, love and S3X, and the line between sacred and sinful. It was a lot blurrier than you'd think. So, were there actually temple Pr0stitutes? Did Roman gods encourage, allow, or frown upon S3X work? Let's light a candle to Venus and find out. Meet the S3X gods. The Roman pantheon was stacked with deities who were very into human intimacy. Some of the top names included Venus, goddess of love, beauty, desire, and, well, Priapus, minor god of fertility, gardens, and gigantic ... endowments. Statues of him were basically ancient, no trespassing signs. Liber and Libra, gods of freedom, wine, and pleasure, especially during festivals. Flora, goddess of flowers and spring, associated with youthful love and fertility. Unlike many later religions, the Romans didn't believe S3X was inherently bad. It was natural, powerful, and when offered in the right way, sacred. That said, not all forms of it were considered equal. Were there temple Pr0stitutes in Rome? This is where things get tricky. You might have heard about sacred Pr0stitution, the idea that women or sometimes men offered their bodies to worshippers as part of religious rituals. This definitely happened in Mesopotamia and parts of the Greek world. But in Rome, not really, at least, not in the official temples. Here's what we do know. Roman temples were often conservative, especially state-run ones. Pr0stitutes might hang around outside temples, taking advantage of big crowds and festival goers, but being an actual sacred S3X worker inside a Roman temple. That's more myth than fact. Still, some festivals got pretty wild, and those moments could feel very close to sacred debauchery. Festivals of flesh. If you were a Roman Pr0stitute, you had holidays, too, and some of those religious festivals. Absolute chaos. Let's look at a few. 1. Floralia Festival of Flora. Late April to early May. Think spring break, but with more goats. People wore bright clothes, drank heavily, and watched performances with adult themes. Pr0stitutes were encouraged to join the games, even performing in public shows. One Roman writer joked that the Floralia was where everyone pretends to be civilized until the flowers bloom. 2. Lupercalia February 15th, a fertility festival involving half-naked young men running around and playfully whipping women with strips of goat skin. It was believed to promote fertility and easy childbirth. While not a Pr0stitute-focused event, it definitely had ... spicy energy. 3. Vinalia rustica August 19th, a wine festival honoring Jupiter and Venus. Pr0stitutes were known to give special offerings to Venus on this day, asking for health, beauty, and a steady stream of customers. Venus, patron of Pr0stitutes. If Roman Pr0stitutes had a favorite goddess, it was definitely Venus, but not the elegant, upper-class version. They preferred Venus Volgavaga, Venus the Wanderer, or Venus Libitina, Venus of lust and death. They prayed to her for protection from violence, more clients, but not creepy ones, please charm, beauty, and staying power in the business. Even left offerings at her altars, mirrors, combs, or coins, thanking her for good nights. One inscription reads, "To Venus, who gave me 3 clients and no bruises, gratitude and wine, always." Vestal Virgins versus Working Women. Let's do a little compare and contrast. Vestal Virgins, elite priestesses sworn to 30 years of chastity. Chosen young, worship the goddess Vesta, keeper of the hearth. Lived like nuns, if they broke their vow, buried alive, no joke. Pr0stitutes, often former slaves or poor women. Worked openly, sometimes legally, worshipped Venus, slept with many, lived on the edge of society. And yet, both roles involved ritual, public presence, and a kind of spiritual symbolism. One guarded the home, the other dealt in pleasure. 2 sides of Rome's complicated view on women, purity and power. Sacred versus shameful in some religions. Pr0stitution was seen as a divine act, connecting the physical and the spiritual. In Rome, it was more tolerated than honored. You weren't burned at the stake for working, but you were still marked with infamia, legal and social shame. You couldn't testify in court, run for office, or marry into certain classes. Still, the presence of Pr0stitutes at festivals, in prayers, and in popular devotion shows that their role was more than just physical. They were part of the city's rhythm, just not part of its respectability. The whisper of the divinity are rare stories, whispered in ancient texts, of women who claimed that serving the gods included offering their bodies. Some were seen as mad, others were celebrated as mystics. One tale tells of a woman in Gaul who believed she channeled Venus herself, and that her nightly work was an offering. No one arrested her. No one praised her, either, but people left coins near her door, just in case the goddess really was watching. Faith, flesh, and final prayers. In the end, Roman Pr0stitutes weren't priests, but they believed. They lit candles, they made offerings, they prayed to Venus to heal sowers and send better clients. Religion wasn't something far away in a marble temple. It was woven into their daily lives. Even in the back room of a noisy tavern, even a woman with a past could hope for protection, peace, and a little divine kindness. Violence, disease, and the dangers of the job. Alright, we've spent a lot of time with Roman Pr0stitutes, learning where they worked, how they lived, who they met, and how some even found a way out. But now it's time to talk about the hardest part of the job. This chapter ain't as fun as toga parties or Venus festivals, but it's real, and it's important. Being a Pr0stitute in ancient Rome was dangerous. Like, really dangerous. Violence, abuse, no legal protection, no medicine, no one coming to help if something went wrong. So what did these women, and sometimes men, actually face? Let's walk through the shadows of the Roman world, where things weren't so glamorous. Violence, an everyday threat. Let's not sugarcoat it. Many Pr0stitutes in Rome were beaten, mistreated, or worse, and no one cared. Some of the most common threats were violent clients who refused to pay or got rough during the act, pimps or brothel owners who used force to keep women in line, random men on the street who thought any woman dressed nicely must be selling something, even jealous wives who attacked women they thought were sleeping with their husbands. There are inscriptions and writings that hint at this constant danger. Bruises, broken bones, worse. In Roman law, It didn't help much. Why? Because of infamia. Once you were labeled as a Pr0stitute, your rights basically vanished. No justice for the infamous, a harsh fact. Roman Pr0stitutes had very little legal protection. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't accuse someone of assault or rape unless it was extremely specific circumstances. They couldn't marry certain types of men. And if they defended themselves, like fighting back, they might be punished for causing the violence. To the Roman legal system, Pr0stitutes were basically seen as always available, so any violence against them was expected. Horrifying, right? Even if a client broke the rules, he probably wouldn't be punished. As one Roman writer put it a bit too casually, she is paid, and so she is owned for the hour. Yikes. Disease, then and now ancient medicine was, let's say, creative. If you caught something painful or itchy after a night of work, your options were prayers to Venus herbal ointments, some of which probably helped, or risky treatments, like lead powder, vinegar douches, or burning sulfur. There were no antibiotics, no safe testing, no modern understanding of stis. Some diseases, like syphilis, likely weren't present yet, but others definitely were. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, yeast infections, urinary tract infections, skin infections, and rashes from poor hygiene. If you worked in a crowded brothel, you had zero privacy, probably shared bedding, and cleaned yourself with cold water and a rag, if that. Let's just say, infection was more common than tips, unwanted pregnancy, and lost children at a constant risk. Pregnancy, there were a few herbal methods used for birth control, like silphium, now extinct plant used for centuries, pomegranate juice, or honey-soaked wool, but none of it was reliable. Abortions were sometimes attempted using herbs, insertion of objects, or even abdominal massages meant to cause miscarriage, of which were dangerous and often deadly. Some Pr0stitutes who got pregnant gave birth, and then kept the child rare, gave it to relatives if they had any, or, sadly, left the baby at exposure sites, places where unwanted infants were abandoned. It's a brutal part of Roman life that affected all poor women, but especially those in S3X work. No health care, no breaks if you got sick, there was no calling in sick, no health insurance, no doctor who took your pulse and said, maybe stay in bed today. You had to keep working. Even if you had a fever, an open sore, cough that wouldn't quit, a toothache, backache, or worse, the only time you rested was if you physically couldn't stand up, and even then, your pimp or brothel owner might force you back to work. In fact, there are records of sick Pr0stitutes being chained to their rooms to prevent them from running away. Enslaved and trapped. Many Pr0stitutes in Rome weren't just workers, they were property. Enslaved women and men were forced into Pr0stitution with no say at all. Their bodies belonged to whoever owned them. They couldn't say no. They couldn't leave. They couldn't even cry out for help, because no one would help them. Some were sold as children. Others were born into it. These people didn't just face danger, they lived it, every day, every night, with no way out unless someone bought their freedom. It's heavy stuff. And it's important to remember, psychological toll, the part we don't see beyond the physical risks. There's the emotional side. Imagine being treated like a thing, not a person. Being touched by strangers you don't like, over and over, being insulted, spat at, or ignored. Never knowing if tonight's client might hurt you. Even the strongest person would break a little over time. We'll never hear most of these voices, but the few that left behind inscriptions or poems hint at deep loneliness. One scratched on a tavern wall reads, "No name, no home, no one. But I am still here." Why tell these stories? Because history isn't just the victories. It's the hard parts, too. The women and men who worked the streets of Rome weren't statues or punchlines. They were real people, tough, tired, surviving the best they could. And even though their names are mostly lost, their lives mattered. So here's to them, the quiet fighters, the ones who made it through another night. Morals, philosophy, and what Romans really thought so. By now you probably get the picture. Pr0stitution in ancient Rome was messy. It was legal but shameful, common but looked down on, and everywhere but also in the shadows. But what did Romans themselves really think about it? Not just the average toga-wearing guy on the street, but the philosophers, writers, and moralists. What did the poets say, the lawgivers, the grumpy old senators? Let's talk about Roman morality and how they made sense of a world where you could worship a goddess one minute and then rent a body the next. And spoiler alert, it's complicated, very Roman morality. It's all about statesmen didn't divide the world into good and evil the way later cultures would. For them, morality was mostly about social roles. Were you doing your duty? Were you respecting the gods, the state, your family? And most importantly, were you staying in your lane? If you were a rich Roman man, you could sleep with just about anyone so long as they were lower status than you. They weren't someone else's wife. You didn't fall in love like a fool. But if you were a woman, or a freeborn man on the receiving end, the rules flipped hard. Basically, Pr0stitutes were immoral not because of the act, but because of their place. They were marked, like gladiators and actors, as people who had traded their bodies for money. And that meant infamy, a legal and social stain that never quite washed off. Enter the philosophers. So, what did the great thinkers of Rome say? Let's check in on a few. 1. Cicero 106–43 BC, lawyer, orator, senator. Big fan of dignity and tradition. Cicero was pretty typical. He didn't love Pr0stitution, but he accepted it as a necessary evil. In one speech, he even said, "If there is anyone who thinks that young men should be forbidden from visiting Pr0stitutes, he is surely too strict." Translation: Look, boys will be boys. 2. Seneca O. for BCE 265 CE, Stoic philosopher, advisor to Nero, lover of self-control. Seneca had a more judgy tone. He warned against chasing after bodily pleasures and saw Pr0stitution as a sign of moral weakness. Not a crime, it's kind of sad, but he didn't blame the women. He mostly blamed the men who couldn't control themselves. 3. Juvenal, late 1st century CE, satirical poet, master of sarcasm, grumpy about everything. Juvenal had a sharp tongue and used it on everyone. He roasted women, men, emperors, Pr0stitutes, and morals in general. According to him, Rome was already morally doomed. So, what's a little paid S3X in the middle of that? Honestly, Juvenal wouldn't be out of place in a modern YouTube comment section. Laws versus reality. Roman lawmakers tried to set boundaries, but mostly for show. Some laws required Pr0stitutes to register with the city, pay taxes on their work, wear certain clothing, especially lower class types, but enforcement was spotty at best. If you were poor or enslaved, no one cared. If you were rich and discreet, even less so. The famous Lex Julia Augustus's morality law punished adultery harshly but didn't actually ban Pr0stitution. Because, again, it was considered a pressure valve for society. Better to pay for it than fall in love with your neighbor's wife. Right. Poets, love, and lust. Let's not forget the poets. Because if you want to understand Roman hearts, go read their love poetry. It's messy, dramatic, and full of contradictions. Take Ovid, for example. He wrote about love affairs gone wrong, and the pleasures of brothels. In Ars Amatoria, the art of love, he even gives tips on where to pick up girls in Rome, including at temples, baths, and theaters. But he also warned about falling too hard for courtesans, because, in the end, they just empty your wallet and break your heart. Love her, touch her, but never trust her. A very Ovid style. It's hard to tell if these poets really believed what they wrote or if they were just trying to sell spicy scrolls. Probably both. Common views on Pr0stitutes. How did everyday Romans feel? Here's the short version. They used Pr0stitutes. They laughed at them, they judged them. But they also accepted them as a fact of life. It's kind of like how modern societies treat certain jobs or lifestyles. People use the services, but still look down on the people who provide them. Hypocrisy? Definitely. New. Not even a little. The double standard. We've said this before, but it's worth repeating. Men had freedom. Women had rules. A man could brag about his wild nights. A woman who did the same, ruined. And if a man paid for S3X, no big deal. But if a woman sold it, she was filthy, shameless, and legally marked. Even elite women who were known to visit brothels in disguise, yes, that happened, faced ruin if they were caught. So, while Romans were chill about S3X, they were deeply judgmental about who was doing what and why. So, were they morally outraged? Not exactly. Romans didn't think Pr0stitution was evil. Just kind of low. A necessary part of city life, like sewage systems or tax collectors. It kept good women safe. It gave restless men a place to go. And it made the city run smoother. But it also reminded them that some people were disposable. That's the part philosophers never fully solved. Echoes of their opinions in the end. Roman thoughts on Pr0stitutes were full of contradictions. They were needed, but despised. They were legal, but tainted. They were all around, but never truly welcome. A few philosophers argued that everyone deserved dignity, even S3X workers. But they were rare. Most Romans shrugged and moved on. The afterlife of Roman Pr0stitutes. Memory, myths, and modern echoes. We've come a long way together. From the grimy back alleys of Subura to the velvet cushions of elite courtesans, from the tax lists to the temples of Venus, we've wandered deep into the complicated, dusty world of Roman Pr0stitution. But now it's time to ask the last big question. What happened after? What happened to these women and men after the work stopped? After they grew older? After they passed on? Did anyone remember them? Or did they just vanish into the cracks of history? Let's talk about what came after the job was done, and why their stories still echo today. Aging out the Roman world wasn't kind to aging Pr0stitutes. In fact, it wasn't kind to aging anyone, but especially not women whose livelihood was based on appearance, youth, and desirability. Once you lost your looks, business slowed down a lot. And there were no retirement plans, no pensions, no cozy brothel-sponsored condos in Naples. Some of the lucky ones became brothel managers, ran their own taverns, married a regular client, rare. But it happened, or used their savings, if they had any, to buy a shop or a food stall. But most simply faded out, working until they physically couldn't anymore. A few were taken in by relatives. Many ended up homeless, and when they died, well, death and burial. In death, Pr0stitutes were often treated differently. If you were rich or well-connected, you could afford a nice tomb, maybe with a carved epitaph. Here lies Lays, beloved of many. But most Pr0stitutes were buried in paupers' fields, mass graves with no names, no inscriptions, no memory. Others might be cremated and dumped into communal urns. That's why we know so few of their names. That said, a few do survive. Inscriptions, scratched into stone walls, or left behind on broken pottery, or chiseled into low-status graves. One found near Pompeii reads, "To Fabia, the most loyal of lovers, you lit up even the darkest street, a whisper from the past, a little spark of memory." Myths and spirits. No, this might surprise you, but in Roman ghost stories, Pr0stitutes showed up quite a bit. The restless dead, especially those who died violently or were never properly buried, were said to wander the city at night. Some people even believed that former Pr0stitutes could come back as lamia, seductive spirits who lured men and then drained their life force. Like ancient Roman succubi, others were thought to haunt their old brothels, still pacing their rooms, trapped in the habits of a life they never chose. Was this just spooky folklore? Probably, but it also shows something deeper. Even if society tried to forget these people, they stayed in the collective imagination. Redemption stories and all memories were grim. Though, a few Roman writers, especially in later centuries, told tales of Pr0stitutes who turned their lives around. One popular story retold centuries later by early Christians was about a courtesan who gave up her life of S3X work, joined a religious cult, and was later venerated as a sort of sinner saint. These redemption stories were dramatic, moralizing, and often fictional, but they show how some Romans imagined a second life for those who'd lived in society's margins, even if it required a total transformation. Recycled reputation Semitis, a former Pr0stitutes name got rebranded. Writers and poets would borrow famous names and turn them into characters in their work. Lays, Phryne, and Delphinia became stock names for clever, beautiful, or tragic women. Like saying Marilyn or Carmen today. Were they real? Maybe. But even if their flesh and blood lives ended, their names kept walking around in stories, plays, and jokes. Modern echoes, and that brings us to now. We still talk about Roman Pr0stitutes. We study their tools, their graffiti, their body-shaped lamps. We dig up their bathhouses and decode their slang. But more than that, we recognize them because the struggles they faced. A lot of it still exists today. Shame around S3X work, double standards based on gender violence without justice being needed, but judged being visible, but invisible. Even though laws and societies have changed, those echoes are still there. That's why telling these stories matters, not to glamorize the past, but to humanize it. A whisper from the walls near the ruins of a Roman brothel in Pompeii. There's a bit of graffiti carved in messy handwriting. It reads, "Felix loved Amaryllis. She was kind to him." It's not a price list. It's not a dirty joke. It's just someone remembering a moment of kindness. And honestly, that might be the best legacy these women could leave behind. Not gold, not fame, just the memory of being human in a world that tried to forget. Good night, Romesso. Here we are. The candles are low, the streets are quiet, and the women of the night have finished their stories. From Subura to Venus's temple, from shame to survival, they lived complex, dangerous, and surprisingly relatable lives. They laughed, they hustled, they cried, they lit lamps in the dark, and now, centuries later, we remember them, not as nameless shadows, but as real people, people with dirty jokes, sharp minds, sore feet, and heavy hearts, people like us.